Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 72, Suzdalia and the Mongols. We left Suzdalia at the death of Vsevolod Big Nest in 1212, often claimed to be the first to officially take the title of Veliki Knyaz, or Great or Grand Knyaz. He had been recognized as the predominant Knyaz of Rus for at least 2 decades. Despite his preeminence, he had clearly rejected Kyiv in favor of ruling his own knyazhestvo, which he did for 36 years of, more or less, peace, in which it grew and flourished. Under his rule, Suzdalia had gained cultural and ecclesiastical importance to go along with the military might it had already demonstrated. As Vsevolod did not sit on the throne of Kyiv, his sons had no claim, removing his family from the competition. However, as we noted back in episode 59, like other knyazes before him, it might seem that Vsevolod failed to draw any conclusions from his own success, and so he divided his kingdom among his sons. The blame actually probably lies more with the sons. Vsevolod had already allocated his eldest son, Constantine, Rostov and 5 other towns to rule. As he approached his death, he tried to give each son an inheritance that would avoid conflict. Constantine would move to rule in Vladimir, and the second son, Yuri, would receive Rostov. It's usually assumed with the 5 other towns as well. Constantine, however, was incensed by this decision. He had already established himself in Rostov, and in his view, he should keep it and add Vladimir rather than swapping. Vsevolod summoned him to Vladimir twice for discussions, but Constantine refused to go. Vsevolod called a congress of his boyars, the bishops of Vladimir and Rostov, other churchmen and servitors, and the chronicle says all the people, making it an early appearance of what would later be called the Zemsky Saburi, or Assemblies of the Land. The Congress did not make any decisions itself. Rather, it witnessed his decision that Vladimir would be given to Yuri, while his third son, Yaroslav, would be given the northern Pereyaslav. When Constantine received word, the chronicle tells us, he was filled with wrath at his brothers. So when Vsevolod died, war did break out among his sons, but it was a limited war in the usual manner of knyaz infighting, not the 4 decades of attrition we saw in Galicia. Yuri and Yaroslav, with another brother, Vladimir, were allies on one side, and Constantine and a younger brother, Sviatoslav, on the other. Yuri and Yaroslav marched on Rostov, but Yuri began with negotiations, telling Constantine that he was ready to swap Vladimir for Rostov. Constantine rejected the offer, saying that Vladimir was for him and Rostov for his son. Instead, he offered Yuri Suzdal. After 4 weeks of talks, a truce was concluded. In the meantime, Vladimir and Sviatoslav swapped sides. Vladimir was unhappy to be given Yuri Polski, obviously thinking he deserved better, Constantine suggested that he go and take Moscow. Sviatoslav switched to Yuri and got given the newly vacated Yuriv-Polsky. These two were still in their teens and had not yet managed to gather any significant druzhina, and it did not really matter one way or another who they supported. The following year, the conflict resurfaced, with Constantine making the first move this time. All the brothers moved in non-critical directions, avoided meeting each other's forces, and went home with the only result being Vladimir getting kicked out of Moscow and sent south to Pereyaslav. There's no mention of any further developments for 3 years. This could have been because they were too busy. Vladimir experienced a serious fire with hundreds of houses and several churches burned. Then there was a famine. Or they could just have been preparing to do something more effective the next time round. In 1216, the brothers fought a proper war. Constantine had Novgorod and the Rostislavichi behind him, while Yuri had Yaroslav, Vladimir, Murom, and the Polovtsi. The whole thing was kicked off by Mstislav, who had just returned from his first inconclusive foray into Galicia. Although, as you recall, Yaroslav was married to Mstislav's daughter, he had taken advantage of Mstislav's absence to occupy Novgorod, arrest some of Mstislav's followers, taken over Torzhok and Voloklamsky, arrested Novgorodian merchants in these towns, and blocked the flow of goods. It was inevitable that Mstislav would try to shift him as soon as he returned. It began with border skirmishes and escalated as Yaroslav called on Yuri, Mstislav called on his brother Vladimir of Pskov, Vladimir Rurikovich of Smolensk, and Mstislav Romanovich of Kiev, as well as sending messengers to see whether Constantine wanted to get involved. Constantine did want to get involved, and eventually the armies of the two sides met on the river Lipitsa. The usual efforts to avoid fighting were made. The chronicles emphasized that no one wanted to fight Yuri, they just wanted to put Yaroslav in his place, and for him to release the Novgorodians he had arrested. Yuri, perhaps seeing himself in his father's shoes, had badly misjudged the situation. He rejected Constantine's overtures with contempt. When Constantine moved on to propose that he be given Vladimir as the eldest, and Yuri take Suzdal, Yuri rejected the offer again. He was so confident that he drew up a written agreement with Yaroslav, deciding who would rule what after the battle. Yuri would take Vladimir and Rostov, Yaroslav would get Novgorod, Sviatoslav would take Smolensk, Kiev would go to the Knyazes of Chernihiv, and Yuri and Yaroslav would divide Galicia between them. The battle, however, ended in total victory for Constantine. Yuri and Yaroslav fled to Vladimir, where there were insufficient men left to defend the city, and Constantine arrived and set fire to the town. Yuri surrendered and was sent to Gorodets Radilov, a small town on the eastern edge of the Knyazhestvo. Yaroslav, who gets a highly negative treatment in the chronicles for this time, fled to Pereyaslav. He threw the Novgorodian merchants into pits, where 150 of them died of suffocation. As his enemies approached, he wrote to Constantine asking him to save him from Mstislav. When they arrived, he handed out generous gifts to all the knyazes. This successfully bought them off, and he was allowed to stay in Pereyaslav. The war was over. Mstislav went home to Novgorod for now. Konstantin occupied Vladimir, although he continued to spend much of his time in Rostov. It looked like Yuri had no cards left to play, but he still had one trump up his sleeve. Simeon, the bishop of Suzdal and Vladimir. The bishop had loyally followed him into what was effectively exile, which created a problem for Constantine. To get the bishop back, Constantine had to make peace with Yuri, by the obvious means, promising Yuri that he would succeed Constantine as the Grand Knyaz, while Constantine's sons, Vasilko and Vsevolod, would get Rostov and Yaroslavl. As it turned out, Yuri did not even have to wait for long. Constantine died just 5 months later, and Yuri returned to Vladimir as Grand Knyaz for the next 21 years. He lived peacefully with his brothers and with Constantine's sons for the next 5 years, the period up to the first encounter with the Mongols. But as we briefly mentioned in the episode on the first Mongol invasion, there was some conflict with the Bulgars. After a period of several years without any flare-ups, the Bulgars attacked the domain of the Knyaz of Rostov. Yuri put together a major response, pulling in troops from across his brother's territories. They sailed into Bulgaria, took Orshil, and defeated a Bulgar army. The campaign was so effective that the Bulgars immediately withdrew and sent repeated embassies begging for peace. Yuri finally agreed, and founded Nizhny Novgorod to defend his borders. This small war marked another shift in the balance of power. Against Dolgoruki and Bogolyubsky, the Bulgars had maintained the upper hand. Against Vsevolod, there had been stalemate. Now, despite the breakup of Suzdalia, the Rus were clearly stronger. Of course, the Mongol conquest would change everything, so we can never know how things might have worked out in the long term. But for now, the Bulgars no longer threatened their neighbours. The prisoners were returned, and the Bulgars provided grain to help after a poor harvest. As we've previously heard, Vladimir and the other northeastern Knyazhstva were either not involved in the first Mongol invasion, or did send a smaller contingent that did not arrive in time to take part in the campaign. Whichever it was, if we're going to follow our interpretation of the events around the battle on the Kalka, that it was not a devastating Mongol victory and fit within the previous Rus experience with steppe peoples, the lack of impact on the northeast is quite understandable. We should not fall into retrospective anachronism in criticizing any supposed lack of preparation, when there would have been no indication to the people of the time that they should be preparing for the Mongols to return. I think the only point we can criticize them for is for failing to respond to the Bulgars, which seems to display a certain prejudice and closed-mindedness, or perhaps they were even glad to see the Bulgars weakened. From 1223 to 1237, the northeast enjoyed relative peace. Yuri was unchallenged as Grand Knyaz. The only conflicts noted were minor incidents with the Mordvins, punitive actions intended to ensure Rus rather than Bulgar control over the trade with the Urals region. Both Yuri's brothers and his nephews abided by his rule, marched on his campaigns when he summoned them, entered the dynastic marriages he told them to, and generally were fully compliant. The chroniclers only mention one dispute with Yaroslav in 1229. Yaroslav is said to have listened to lying advisors who spread falsehoods about Yuri, and the situation is resolved when Yuri summons him and his supporters to Suzdal, where they kiss the cross and acknowledge him as father and master. Yuri had an early conflict with Novgorod. First, they rejected his son, Vsevolod, an 8-year-old child, as knyaz. Given that the primary role of the knyaz in Novgorod was to serve as military leader, this seems understandable. Yuri sent Yaroslav to replace him. Yaroslav departed after just a few months, presumably as a result of a dispute with the boyars. Vsevolod was sent again and was rejected again. Now Yuri came in force. He joined Vsevolod at Torzhok, bringing Yaroslav, Vasilko of Rostov, and Mikhail Vsevolodovich of Chernihiv. He demanded that Novgorod hand over some boyars, presumably the ones who had the conflict with Yaroslav and rejected Vsevolod, although it's not specified. The Novgorodians stood their ground, and eventually an agreement was reached that the Novgorodians would pay Yuri a fine and accept Mikhail of Chernihiv as knyaz. Mikhail and Yaroslav would continue to tussle over the city, but Yuri never had dealings with it again. Yuri maintained good relations with the Rostislavichi, and he also got along with the Olgovichi. Following Big Nest's marriage to Vsevolod Cherny's daughter in 1211, the younger generations of the two families had continued to intermarry and remained allies. No conflicts between Yuri and Mikhail are recorded in any of the surviving versions of the chronicles. The only real point of contention in the northeast was Novgorod. The era where Novgorod was a stepping stone to Kiev and a target for all the leading families was well past. Now the problems were due as much to the city's internal rivalries as to competition among the knyazes. The expanding Baltic trade, driven by the rise of the Hanseatic colonies, encouraged the boyars and merchants to seek more power for themselves, and the rival parties were willing to work together to limit the power of the knyaz and raise the power of their own officials, the Pasadnik and the Tisyatsky. They could not get rid of the knyaz, since he commanded the military, and the city had to be defended against the Germans, Swedes, Lithuanians, and Chud, as well as other Rus. Why the city was never able to, or never chose to, develop its own forces is something of a mystery. We have no sources that allow us to address this conundrum at all, but as we've covered in the Baltic episodes, this is the period in which attacks on Novgorod from the west begin to increase. There is a double bind here. As Novgorod became more dangerous, it became less attractive to potential knyazes. Why put yourself in the way of risk? More fighting meant that the knyaz needed more funds to reward his men, increasing the burden on the boyars, who wanted less involvement of the knyaz in the Novgorod economy. This resulted in the situation we've just discussed with Yuri, where a child would end up being sent as a token ruler. The child didn't interfere in boyar business, but didn't lead the defense either. The same thing had happened with Mstislav. When he went to Galicia, he left his son in charge, and when a threat arose, the city expelled him because Mstislav had failed to defend the city. When Yuri turned his back on Novgorod, he left the city to a rivalry between Mikhail and Yaroslav that would last the best part of a decade. Over this period, Mikhail, his son Rostislav, and Yaroslav and his sons, Fyodor and Alexander, would all occupy the knyaz's residence in Novgorod, Yaroslavl Dvor. The rivalry frequently brought Yaroslav and Mikhail to the edge of war, although war never quite broke out. The knyaz's rivalry was fed by the rivalry between two competing factions of boyars in the city. A group led by Ivanko Dmitrievich, who became posadnik in 1219, and then by Stepan Tverdislavic, who was the son of Tverdislav, the previous posadnik and close ally of Suzdalia. This group backed Yaroslav and his sons. Against them were Vsevolod Vodovik, who took over as posadnik when Ivanko was forced to flee to Yaroslav. His family, brothers Mikhail and Danislav, and his son Gleb, along with the support of Boris Negatievich, who became the Tiesatsky in 1229. These, of course, were all supporting Mikhail. The chronicles describe the relations between the two fractions as quarrels, which periodically resulted in uprisings or revolts, rather than calling it war. The swings between them were affected by the wider relations between Yaroslav and Mikhail, and by the factors we described a few minutes ago, which discouraged either from fully committing to the city. The final uprising and change of knyaz took place in 1230. In 1229, Yaroslav was trying to recruit Novgorod and Pskov for a campaign against Riga. Opposition to this led to Ivanko being replaced as posadnik by Knyaz Vodovik, and Ivanko's flight to Yaroslav. Mikhail arrived in the city, and the takeover was complete. However, in early 1230, Mikhail returned to Chernihiv, leaving his son, Rostislav, just 5 years old, to be knyaz. Unhappy about being left without a commander once again, the Yaroslav faction called a veche to challenge Vodovik. Vodovik's faction, in turn, agitated against the opposition. Rioting broke out, houses were looted and burned, 2 people were killed. Vodovik and Boris Negatievich fled to Chernihiv, and Yaroslav soon arrived to displace Rostislav. Vodovik died in Chernihiv in 1231, but Boris Negatievich set out later in the year to regain Novgorod for Mikhail. He was abandoned by the minor Rogovich knyaz assigned to support him, but did manage to seize control of Pskov. Pskov seemed willing to accept him until Yaroslav embargoed the city. Boris was expelled. He fled to the Teutonic Order at what the Rus called Medvezhya Golova and the Bolt Otenpa. And in 1233, with German support, he made another attempt on Pskov, taking Izborsk, but was captured and sent to imprisonment in Pereyaslav. And with that, the battles for Novgorod were over. Yaroslav had won through a combination of his own military skill, substantial support within the city, and perhaps most importantly, his knyazhestvo being much closer to Novgorod than Chernihiv was. With the control of Novgorod settled, the northeast enjoyed several years of peace until the Mongol invasion. The deaths of Yuri and Vasilko Konstantinovich fighting the Mongols meant that Yaroslav succeeded Yuri in Vladimir, and he appointed his brother Sviatoslav to Suzdal. Younger brother Ivan received Starodub. As we saw in Galicia, they do not really seem to have realized what the Mongol attacks meant. The chronicle entry for the year simply states that after the Mongols moved on in March 1238, there was peace. Yaroslav was 48 years old when the Mongols invaded. He had a couple of decades of successful experience governing the northern Pereyaslav, his patrimonial domain bordering Novgorod. Novgorod itself, he won his rivalry against Mikhail of Chernihiv. He'd briefly taken Kiev, and he had defended his domains against German, Scandinavian, and Lithuanian invaders. So it's no surprise that he had the reputation and respect to succeed to the throne of Vladimir without challenge. Nothing much is known about his family and children before the invasion. His eldest son, Fyodor, had died at 14 before that, and Alexander, who was around 18 when the Mongols arrived, held Novgorod from 1236 to 1240. His other sons, Andrei, Konstantin, Yaroslav, Daniil, and Mikhail, all survived the invasion. In this initial period, it seemed like the only change resulting from the invasion was that the knyazes of the northeast were required to travel to Sarai to see Batu or his son Sartak and get their authority confirmed. Unlike the knyazes of the south, Yaroslav and his neighbours seem to have gone along with this without objection at their first request. In some tellings, this is because Yaroslav's son Alexander had already befriended Sartak. The result was that in the first 10 years the Mongols were at Sarai, Suzdalian knyazes visited Sarai at least 19 times, and knyazes made the journey thousands of kilometers to Karakorum 4 times. Yaroslav went in 1243. According to the chroniclers, Batu gave him his yarlik with the words, "O Yaroslav, may you be the senior of the knyazes in the Rus lands." Whether or not Batu actually declared him the senior knyaz of the Rus doesn't really matter. It was a meaningless title, since Yaroslav had no way of imposing his authority over any of the other knyazes unless he went and did it by force. What was more significant, although it's doubtful that the knyazes realized all the implications at once, was that the Mongols had upended the system of genealogical seniority. Batu might have issued a yarlik to Yaroslav because he was the senior knyaz, but there was absolutely nothing that was going to make Batu follow the Rus succession system when he appointed the next or other knyazes. Although Yaroslav had previously been a vigorous military campaigner, he was mostly peaceful in the 8 years that he ruled after the invasion. The only exception, as we heard in the previous episode, was in 1239, when he launched a sudden, unexpected attack on Kamenets. Although he was allied with Daniil of Halych and their families had marriage ties, the attack was probably more motivated by the chance to kick his old enemy, Mikhail of Chernihiv, while he was down. He gave his captives over to Daniil and did not try to develop the attack into anything bigger. On his way back, he fought off a Lithuanian invasion of Smolensk and settled a succession dispute there by placing Vsevolod Mstislavich on the throne. This interference was further evidence of the decline of the Rostislavichi. After that, the only mentions of his activity concerned those visits to the Mongols. It's probable that the yarlik he was given in 1243 included recognizing him as Knyaz of Kiev. since there is one mention that he appointed a man named Dmitry Aikovich as governor there, but that's the only information we're given. There's nothing in the chronicles to suggest that he ever went back to Kiev, but given that the lords of Vladimir had already made their preference for the northeast plain, it's not clear that we should take this as evidence supporting the destruction of Kiev. However, Kiev and the Kiev lands play no significant role in the chronicles during the Mongol period. All we know about his trip to Karakorum is that he was summoned by Batu but then told he had to go to Mongolia. There's nothing immediately strange about this, although Batu was functionally independent in his day-to-day rule of the Ulus of Joti. He remained formally subordinate to the Great Khan, and therefore the Great Khan had the right to verify any of his decisions, such as recognizing the local rulers of tributary states. Most of Yaroslav's retinue died on the long and arduous journey, and he himself was either poisoned by Ogeday's widow or died on the way home. Although it is entirely possible that he died of natural causes while travelling, historians have favoured the poisoning version. The report that he was poisoned comes from Giovanni de Pleno Carpini, who was travelling with the Rus party and would have had access to the information. The statement in the chronicle that he died among foreigners while travelling from the Great Khan could be an example of the chronicler's typical reluctance to write things the Mongols might not like, such as how they killed Yaroslav. Why he was poisoned is a different matter. There are a lot of theories here, but the most plausible one might be that since Khan Gurk and Batu were enemies, and Yaroslav was, as far as the Mongols were concerned, Batu's man, someone from Guyuk's faction did it to get at Batu. The Mongol invasions provide the clearest possible illustration that Kievan Rus, as it was invented in the 19th century historiography, a centralized, unified state centered on Kiev, never existed. Yes, you can make good arguments that Vladimir Monomach and his son Vsevolod tried to lay the foundations for such a state, and weaker arguments for efforts by some of the other prominent knyazes, but it just didn't happen. The main obstacle to the unification project, if we're going to say it existed, was the system of lateral succession that Yaroslav the Wise had put into place. And the Monomashichi, especially the branch of the ruling family in Suzdalia, were the strongest adherents and proponents of this system. If Monomach's alleged plan had worked, and we saw several generations of father-to-son transmission of the throne of Kiev, things could have worked out very differently. But as it was, the rotating title provoked constant conflict, prevented consolidation, and turned the knyazes into each other's enemies. And as we've also seen, the lateral succession broke the strength and obstructed the development of the individual knyazhestva as well. The effect was not simply that the knyazes were prisoners of their own internal rivalries, unable to join together to resist the Mongols, or that the knyazes of the south were too exhausted to put up a fight. But there was no system, no state structure, no administration, and no organization that could have enabled them to do so. What had been Suzdalia was, by the time the Mongols arrived, divided among brothers who, by all the evidence we have, lived together peacefully, but even they could not consolidate their forces to meet the threat. Every knyaz was king of his own domain. There was no central administration, no central command. Knyazes could ask their personal allies to help them in a fight, but no one could command the knyazes to assemble their forces and meet at a designated place to fight as they were ordered. Even when a coalition was assembled, as we've seen time and time again, people would not come, others would leave early, switch sides in the middle, or just refuse to fight. The people of Rus had mutually intelligible languages and dialects, the Orthodox Church and related ruling families in common, but no uniting state. The people of Nizhny Novgorod, Smolensk or Murom did not expect the Knyaz of Kiev to provide them with justice, famine relief, or protection from outside invaders. Over the first century of the tale of bygone years, the names of the Slavic tribes of Rus, the Polyani, Slovenes, Radomichians, and so on that you'll remember from the first episodes, are gradually dropped. The Vyatichi hang around a bit longer because everybody else is still avoiding crossing their land, but the chroniclers move to calling the Christian inhabitants of the region Rus. But 200 years later, when the Mongol invasions end the rivalry for Kiev and the Knyazhist would go their own way, the borders still look a lot like those old tribal borders. And we have to assume that if those people did see themselves as Rus, that Rus identity was not necessarily collected to Kiev. And this is what makes any claim that a single entity, whether Vladimir or Galicia, is the sole heir and successor to Rus, unsustainable, and why Rus needs to be treated as its own thing, rather than just an earlier stage of any of the countries that later appear in the region. As we saw in the southwest in the last episode, the Mongols were largely absent for the first decade after the invasion. There's little evidence to support the tales of destruction and devastation found in the chronicles and repeated by later historians. Public building work did not stop, although it did slow down. Churches, cathedrals, and monasteries were still built in the old towns, and as new towns like Moscow and Tver increased in significance, they developed their own architectural schools. Muslim historians and Western writers report an interruption in trade due to the Mongols mass conscripting artisans, but this is hard to see in the archaeological record. There seems to have been no impact on agriculture. The Mongols did not touch the peasants as they wanted them to supply them with grain. There is evidence that Ryazan, Vladimir, Dozhok, Kozyelsk, Pereyaslavo, Chernihiv, Kolodyazhin, Kamenets, Kyiv, Halych, and Vladimir in Volhynia did indeed suffer various degrees of destruction during their capture by the Mongols, but no archaeological evidence at the other towns the chronicles say were captured. Some of them do not even show signs of fighting. As you would expect, the various regional chronicles become increasingly local in their focus and provide less supporting evidence for each other than before. Given the scale of the invasion, it's reasonable for us to assume that there was widespread destruction and disruption, but it also seems like recovery was quite rapid. Our histories, from the Mongols all the way through to the 20th century, consistently underestimate the ability of peasants to just run away from trouble and come back later. Maybe that chronicle entry saying the rest of the year was peaceful was actually a good reflection of how the people felt. But little immediate impact did not mean that the impact would not increase over time. And in the meantime, while there may be little record of the Mongols' impact on the northeast or of Yaroslav's actions over this period, there was more action on the other side of the country, at the Baltic border, where Yaroslav's son, Alexander Nevsky, voted the greatest Russian in history, was in charge. Join me next episode as we examine whether that reputation is justified. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.